Imagine an invention powerful enough to end the oil industry. A car that needs no fuel, no charging, and no dependency on any power grid. It generates its own energy from the air around it, enough to even power an entire home. This isn't science fiction. It's the real invention of an African engineer, Maxwell Chikumbutso from Zimbabwe, but then it vanished. No international media coverage, no research institute support, no government endorsement. One of Maxwell's closest allies died mysteriously while helping him file a patent in the US. Maxwell himself survived a suspected poisoning attempt. The media branded him a fraud, and the car, something that could disrupt the entire global energy structure, was buried in silence. Why? Because it threatened too much. It shook oil empires. It broke the business model of electric vehicle giants. It required no Chinese lithium. It was everything the world's power structures didn't want to exist, especially when it came from Africa. But just as the world tried to bury it, one man stood up. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso, once considered the poorest country on earth, rejected Western aid, expelled foreign troops, and called for a fully sovereign African tech future. Then he made a bold invitation. Bring that car to Burkina Faso. We will protect it. We will build it. No permission needed. Do you believe that Africa has the right to create produce and own its own technologies? Do you believe that no one can stop a people rising through intelligence and dignity? Share this story. Every share is a declaration we will no longer bow. Spread the spirit of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who dared to say no to oppression and yes to the future. And may God protect us and guide us toward a self-reliant, empowered, and radiant Africa. For a tomorrow where our children can proudly say, technology by Africans for Africans made in Africa. Etui, for decades the global energy landscape has been shaped by one law dependency, oil dependency, grid dependency, lithium dependency. And the countries that don't own the resources, they pay the price. Africa, despite holding over 30% of the world's mineral wealth, remains a mere consumer locked out of high-end innovation, trapped in cycles of extraction and export, until one man decided to break the cycle. Maxwell Chikumbutso was not born into privilege. Raised in the densely populated streets of Harare, Zimbabwe, he built his first radio transmitter at the age of 14. By 26, he had already designed an electric-powered generator that needed no external fuel. But what truly stunned the world, at least those who dared to believe, was what came next. In a small lab surrounded by skeptics and silenced Chikumbutso, unveiled Seth, the world's first self-charging electric vehicle. The car was unlike anything seen before. No fuel, no charging port, no battery banks. Just a sleek, lightweight body embedded with a device that converted ambient radio frequencies into continuous electrical energy. The car reportedly powered itself indefinitely, reaching speeds of 220 kilometers per hour while delivering enough energy to light up an entire home. It was in essence the death blow to oil, lithium, and fossil-fueled greed. The announcement caused ripples on fringe science forums, YouTube channels, and underground tech groups, but mainstream media silent, government officials absent, corporate interest non-existent. Instead, the backlash came like a storm cloaked in shadows. Within weeks of his public demo in the United States, Chikumbutso's close associate tasked with helping him file an international patent was found dead. No investigation, no follow-up, just silence. Chikumbutso himself became violently ill after a shared meal, an incident his inner circle believes was a failed assassination attempt. He returned to Zimbabwe disillusioned and isolated. Suddenly, all his interviews were flagged. All his social media links throttled. His invention, one that could have redefined modern civilization, was smeared as a hoax, a fraud, a delusion. But those close to the technology knew the truth. It wasn't that the science didn't work, it's that it worked too well. A vehicle that runs on nothing, that would make gas stations obsolete. No more dependency on rare earths. Say goodbye to China's lithium monopoly. No charging stations, Tesla, Rivian, BYD, all rendered redundant in an instant. The oil cartels, the green energy giants, the auto titans, they weren't ready for a world where a barefoot Zimbabwean engineer rewrote the rules. And so, the suppression began. Anonymous emails warned Chikumbutso to stop. Financial backers suddenly withdrew. Scientific journals rejected his research before even reviewing it. In Zimbabwe, he received no support, just cold bureaucracy and unanswered letters. The very country that should have celebrated him chose instead to disappear him. Because his invention wasn't just a car, it was a rebellion, a declaration that Africa no longer had to beg, borrow, or import its future, that the minds of this continent were not second class. That innovation didn't need to be stamped, made in Europe or designed in Silicon Valley to be real, and that perhaps was the most dangerous idea of all. Maxwell Chikumbutso became a ghost. The media ignored him. His videos were demonetized or removed. When he did speak, it was with a hint of fear, as though he knew the forces he'd awakened. One of his final public statements was chilling in its simplicity. "I'm not trying to change the world. I'm just trying to show that Africans can." And perhaps that's exactly why they tried to erase him. Because if one African could, others might follow. And then the monopoly would crack. The global system built on African dependence would begin to fracture. Oil might still flow, lithium might still be mined, but the illusion of technological superiority would be gone. Forever. So Chikumbutso's invention didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it threatened to succeed. And as the world turned its back on him, one leader half a continent away was quietly watching, waiting, preparing. A soldier, a revolutionary, and a man who would not bow to global masters. His name Captain Ibrahim Traoré. And he was about to do something no African leader had ever done. While the rest of the world chose to ignore, erase, or bury Maxwell Chikumbutso's invention, one man thousands of kilometers away was paying attention, and not just paying attention, he was preparing. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, was unlike any head of state Africa had seen in decades. He didn't rise through handshakes with Western diplomats. He didn't study in elite universities in France or the United States. He came from the barracks, from the dust, from the people. A former artillery officer, Traoré led a popular coup in 2022, toppling a government many had come to see as a puppet of foreign interests. His mission, simple yet radical: total liberation from foreign control. The name Burkina Faso means land of the upright people. Under Traoré's rule, that phrase was no longer ceremonial. It became a declaration of war against dependency. He expelled French troops. He ended military agreements with Western powers. He banned NGOs suspected of meddling. He nationalized key sectors, and perhaps most radically, he declared that Burkina Faso would no longer beg for aid. "We will not survive on crumbs from those who robbed us," he told a roaring crowd in Ouagadougou. "We will build what we need. We will feed ourselves. We will invent. And if we fail, at least, we will fail standing." To many outside observers, this sounded like madness. How could one of the world's poorest nations suddenly talk of innovation, of sovereignty, of technological revolution? But Traoré had something that most leaders lacked: conviction. And he had a plan. Burkina Faso was already experimenting with indigenous solutions, building local manufacturing plants, funding agritech research, and most notably developing its own electric vehicle. Named a Tawa, the car was fully designed and assembled by local engineers. It wasn't just a product, it was a statement. We can do this too. But Traoré knew that for Africa to truly break the chains, it needed a symbol, a spark. Something bigger than a Tawa, something that could shock the system. That's when he heard about Chikumbutso. Not through mainstream news, but through encrypted channels, dissident scientists, African forums that refused to be silenced. He read about the Seth car. He watched the banned videos. He studied the assassination attempt, and in the silence surrounding Maxwell's disappearance, Traoré heard the loudest truth of all. They're afraid of this man, which means we should protect him. So Traoré did something no African head of state had ever done before. He publicly invited Maxwell Chikumbutso to bring his invention to Burkina Faso, not to sell it, not to beg for investors, but to build it under the full protection of a government that would defend it with soldiers if necessary. In a televised speech, Traoré looked directly into the camera and said, "Brother Maxwell, if the world has no place for your genius, come to Burkina Faso. We will not let them kill your dream. We will not let them erase you. We will give you land. We will give you people. And we will build the future together." The speech went viral across African platforms. Young Africans, long tired of being told what's possible, began to share the clip with the hashtag #Gao Africa Can Too. Memes exploded. Underground tech channels flooded with old footage of Maxwell's prototypes. Chikumbutso's name, once buried, was now resurrected, and this time, not as a curiosity, but as a call to arms. Because Traoré's message wasn't just about one man. It was about all Africans who had been told their minds were not enough, that their ideas had to be validated in Europe, that their genius needed a white sponsor to be real. He shattered that illusion with a single declaration: Africa will validate itself. Critics in the West scoffed. Media outlets called him reckless. Analysts warned of sanctions. Rumors of plots began swirling. But Traoré was unmoved. He had survived multiple assassination attempts already. He knew what he was up against. And he didn't flinch. Instead, he doubled down. He ordered Burkina Faso's Ministry of Innovation to draft a legal framework that would allow foreign African inventors to seek asylum funding and partnership, no strings attached. He renamed national laboratories after revolutionary African scientists. He launched a continental call for tech refugees, thinkers, tinkerers, engineers who had been silenced elsewhere. And then he went a step further. He announced the creation of a sovereign tech fund, fueled by gold reserves and local taxes, not foreign loans, to finance African-born innovation. And at the center of it all, a quiet proposal: to build the first ever Seth car prototype, legally protected, fully African-owned, on Burkina soil. It wasn't just an offer. It was a gauntlet thrown at the feet of the world, a dare, a warning. If you try to stop this again, you will no longer be silencing one man. You will be challenging an entire nation. This wasn't just about energy anymore. It was about dignity. It was about rewriting the narrative that Africa's only role in technology is to mine the cobalt, ship the lithium, buy the batteries, and applaud the inventors from afar. No more. Burkina Faso under Traoré was declaring, "We will no longer feed the machine. We will build our own." And the world once again was watching. But this time, Africa was not asking for permission. In the shadows of crumbling empires and exhausted oil wells, something unprecedented was forming. Not a summit, not a treaty, but a simple handshake across borders, across silence, across fear. The alliance between Maxwell Chikumbutso and Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not signed in golden ink. It was forged in resistance, sealed with conviction, and it was perhaps the most dangerous partnership Africa had ever seen. Dangerous not because it was illegal, but because it was possible. In a continent long trained to outsource its dreams and license its genius to the highest bidder, this alliance dared to whisper the unspeakable: what if Africa kept its brilliance to itself? For the fossil fuel industry, it was a nightmare. For lithium extractors and battery giants, it was an existential threat. For Western and Eastern powers alike, it was a disruption they could not afford. If successful, this partnership could mark the beginning of a technological uprising, one that wouldn't be powered by foreign grants or overseas investors, but by raw African ingenuity protected by African leadership. It started quietly. A small lab in Burkina Faso, once used for agricultural studies, was retrofitted with electromagnetic shielding. Engineers, some from Chikumbutso's old team, others trained in secret, were flown in under diplomatic protection. Security was doubled. Internet access was controlled. Nothing left the premises without approval from the highest level of government. Outside Burkina Faso's state TV began airing short documentaries on African inventors. Schools were given textbooks highlighting Chikumbutso's story. His name began to reappear not as a footnote, but as a pioneer. But the world was not sleeping. Within weeks, reports emerged of cyber attacks targeting Burkinabe infrastructure. Internal documents from the Ministry of Innovation leaked onto encrypted forums. Offers came quietly to Chikumbutso money asylum fame in exchange for shelving the project. He refused. Then came the warnings. A senior advisor to Traoré was poisoned during a dinner in Togo. Burkina Faso's gold export routes were suddenly disrupted. International donors froze unrelated development grants. The pressure was subtle, deniable, and unmistakably coordinated, and that was just the beginning. Anonymous media campaigns began circulating stories labeling Chikumbutso a fraud, calling Seth a scam, and accusing Burkina Faso of harboring pseudoscience. Journalists who tried to cover the story were redirected. YouTube videos showcasing the technology were flagged or demonetized. Online, the invention was buried under noise. But something had changed. Burkina Faso wasn't retreating. In fact, it escalated. Traoré made a second broadcast this time, flanked by engineers, scientists, and members of his cabinet. Behind him on live television, a prototype of the new Seth vehicle sat on a rotating stage. The moment was symbolic, raw, and electric. This is not just a car, Traoré declared. It is a declaration that Africa will not be silenced, that our minds are not for sale, and that our future cannot be vetoed. The prototype roared silently to life, its wheels spinning, dashboard lit, energy flowing without a plug in sight. It wasn't perfection, but it was real. And in that moment, something broke. All across Africa, young engineers and scientists flooded forums and encrypted channels with ideas, improvements, schematics. Retired professors from Kenya to Mali began offering guidance. A pan-African digital movement emerged under a new banner, Nars Techno Chains. Because that's what this really was about. Not just one car, not just one man, but the breaking of a spell, one that had convinced Africans for decades that innovation only came from the north. That genius had a passport. That invention required permission. The world responded with panic. Suddenly, global oil prices dipped, hedging against what some feared could be a massive energy disruption if the Seth car reached scale. Lithium futures wobbled. A leaked document from a Western intelligence agency warned of potential destabilization if African nations begin mass adoption of self-sustaining technologies. And in high-level meetings from Brussels to Beijing, one name kept coming up. Burkina Faso. The tiniest player on the board had become a kingmaker. Inside Africa, the response was mixed. Some governments praised Traoré. Others, terrified of retaliation, distanced themselves. But the people, the youth, the marginalized, the forgotten, had found their symbol, and they weren't letting go. Meanwhile, the prototype testing continued. Reports suggested the vehicle could already operate continuously for over 72 hours without recharging. A second version was in development, optimized for rural terrains. Plans were drafted for a local factory staffed by Burkinabe workers trained in electromagnetic field applications. A curriculum was created for public universities, and quietly one more thing began. Talks of an African sovereign technology pact, a continental agreement inspired by Traoré's boldness to protect homegrown innovation from foreign suppression. The pact would offer sanctuary funding, legal protection, and most importantly, a platform for African scientists, engineers, and thinkers whose ideas threatened the global status quo. It wasn't signed yet. But the very idea of it was sending shockwaves through boardrooms and embassies worldwide. Because for the first time, Africa was not reacting to the world, it was leading it. Not with war, not with aid, but with innovation. Chikumbutso and Traoré had done something no one expected. They'd turned a car into a cause, a prototype into a protest, an invention into an international incident. And behind closed doors, the world was asking a new kind of question. What if we can't stop them this time? This is not just the story of a car. This is the story of a continent that has been told for centuries what it cannot do. A continent of miners, not makers. Of consumers, not creators. Of borrowers, not builders. A continent whose genius has been extracted, exported, and erased, until all that remained was silence. But not anymore. The alliance between Maxwell Chikumbutso and Captain Ibrahim Traoré shattered that silence. It broke the illusion that African innovation must wait for foreign validation. It declared without apology or hesitation that Africa will no longer ask permission to invent. And that is terrifying to the powers that be. Because if Africa stops asking, if Africa begins building openly, unapologetically and independently, the entire world, order shifts. No more debt diplomacy. No more extraction without ownership. No more applause for foreign aid while African ideas are buried alive. This partnership between an inventor once left for dead and a leader once underestimated became something bigger than itself. It became a mirror, a question, a challenge. What if Africa stops following? What if it starts leading? We've already seen glimpses. In the quiet hum of the Seth prototype, in the determined eyes of Burkinabe engineers, in the whispers of students dreaming not just of escaping the continent, but of changing it, in the courage of a nation that though poor in money is now rich in meaning, and in the shadows the old systems tremble, because they know you can kill a man, you can bury an idea, but you cannot stop a people who believe again, and Africa is starting to believe, not just in one car, not just in one leader, but in itself. And belief once awakened cannot be put back to sleep. The road ahead will not be easy. There will be sabotage. There will be pressure propaganda and pain. Corporations will lobby. Superpowers will interfere. Some African leaders will fold under pressure. Others will betray the cause. But the seed has already been planted, and it is growing. In Nairobi, students are coding AI for energy distribution. In Lagos, engineers are reverse engineering battery systems. In Bamako, farmers are experimenting with solar automation for crops. In Addis Ababa, youth are designing drones with locally sourced materials. These aren't isolated sparks. They are part of a fire that says, we will no longer be the testing ground. We will be the origin. Chikumbutso's invention may have been the match, but Traoré's courage was the fuel. Together they lit something the world is still struggling to contain. And maybe that's the real lesson here. That the greatest threat to the old world isn't war or rebellion. It's a continent daring to believe it can define its own destiny. So what comes next? That depends on you. Because this story doesn't end here. It begins with the next voice that refuses to be silenced. The next young inventor who refuses to sell their dream for a plane ticket. The next leader who dares to choose sovereignty over safety. It begins with a continent that stops exporting its genius and starts defending it. And most of all, it begins with those willing to speak up, to share, and to stand. Because history isn't written by those who wait for permission. It is written by those who act. So we ask you now, not as a viewer, but as a participant. Do you believe Africa has the right to invent, to produce, and to own its future? Do you believe that no global power, no industry, no cartel can stop a continent united by purpose and driven by pride? Then don't just watch, share this story. Every share is a message to the world. We are done waiting, we are rising. Let this be the beginning of something greater. Let it echo from village radios to university halls, from dusty labs to crowded marketplaces. This is Africa's time, not to follow, but to lead. And may God bless every inventor, every protector, every believer who dares to say, this is ours, for us, by us, forever. The story of Maxwell Chikumbutso and Captain Ibrahim Traoré teaches us that the most powerful revolutions are not always fought with weapons, but with ideas, especially when those ideas come from the margins. At the heart of this story is a question that challenges centuries of global assumptions. What happens when African innovation refuses to ask for permission? The lesson here is not merely about an electric vehicle or a political leader. It is about reclaiming the right to imagine, invent, and lead on African terms. For too long, Africa has been conditioned to see itself as a continent of raw materials, not finished products. It has been expected to mine, not manufacture, to export its best minds to foreign labs, not build laboratories of its own. The genius of African inventors like Chikumbutso has often been met with ridicule, suppression, or outright sabotage, not because their ideas lacked merit, but because their success would threaten deeply entrenched economic structures built on African dependence. The disappearance of Chikumbutso's invention is not merely a tale of conspiracy, it is a case study in how global systems are designed to preserve the status quo by stifling disruptive innovation from unexpected places. Captain Traoré's intervention, inviting Maxwell to build in Burkina Faso, flips this narrative. It is a radical act of leadership rooted in sovereignty. His refusal to accept that African progress must come through Western validation signals a new model of statehood, one that defends intellectual freedom, protects innovation, and fosters indigenous development as a matter of national pride. In doing so, Traoré redefines what it means to lead in the 21st century, not through compliance, but through courage. The lesson here is that leadership is not about seeking favor with superpowers, but about defending the dignity of one's people, even when it invites retaliation. This story also exposes the layered nature of modern colonization. No longer enforced with shackles and gunboats, today's colonization is often intellectual and technological. Africa is permitted to consume, but not to create. It is permitted to assemble, but not to invent. When it does invent, its genius is dismissed as a hoax or bought out in secret. The lesson is clear: freedom today is not only political or economic, it is cognitive. The ability to think freely, invent independently, and own the fruits of one's imagination is the new frontier of liberation. Yet the lesson is not only one of resistance, it is also one of construction. The alliance between Traoré and Chikumbutso reveals what becomes possible when a government chooses to support rather than suppress innovation. By offering protection resources and dignity to an inventor, Burkina Faso created conditions for technological sovereignty. This teaches us that statecraft in Africa must move beyond managing crises and instead focus on cultivating local potential. National budgets must allocate funding for science not as charity, but as strategy. Schools must teach that African genius is not an exception, but an inheritance. Another vital lesson lies in the response from African youth. The viral spread of Traoré's invitation, the resurgence of Chikumbutso's name, and the emergence of hashtags like technochains all point to a rising generation that refuses to inherit inferiority. This youth is not waiting for development, they are building it. The story reminds us that inspiration is contagious, and when one country dares to believe, others begin to question their own silence. That belief is the most dangerous force in the world, because it cannot be bought, silenced, or invaded. It spreads quietly, but irreversibly. Moreover, the suppression tactics used against Chikumbutso, media erasure, digital censorship, financial isolation, and even physical harm, demonstrate the extent to which innovation can be politicized. We learn that technological advancement is never neutral. When it comes from places the world expects to be silent, it is treated as a threat. The lesson for African innovators is to remain vigilant and to build networks of support that can withstand this kind of sabotage. Protection must not only be legal or financial, it must be cultural. Africa must learn to celebrate its own breakthroughs loudly and unapologetically. The global reaction market tremors, intelligence reports, and media deflections reveals how tightly the current world order is bound to African compliance. Any move toward African self-sufficiency is seen not just as competition, but as rebellion. This teaches us that African innovation will not be integrated gently into global systems. It must be defended. It must be backed by national institutions taught in public schools and celebrated in public discourse. Until Africa sees itself as a continent of builders, the world will continue to see it only as a continent of buyers. Lastly, this story reaffirms a truth that is often obscured in global narratives. Africa's wealth is not only in its minerals, but in its mines. And perhaps that is what global powers fear the most, not the loss of resources, but the awakening of human potential. Chikumbutso's invention was dangerous not because it didn't work, but because it did. Traoré's leadership is dangerous not because it is anti-Western, but because it is pro-African. The lesson is that Africa doesn't need permission to be great, it only needs the courage to believe in itself. In the end, the story of Traoré and Chikumbutso is not just an anecdote, it is a blueprint, a prototype, a reminder that what seems impossible today becomes inevitable tomorrow once someone dares to start. The real invention here may not be the Seth car. It may be the idea that Africa can dream for itself, build for itself, and defend those dreams with unity, purpose, and pride. This is the future that awaits, a future not of borrowed time or borrowed tools, but of African ownership. It is a future that begins not in a foreign lab, but in a Burkina workshop, not in a European summit, but in a Zimbabwean garage. And most of all, it begins in the minds of those who refuse to let the world define what Africa can or cannot do. That is the most important lesson of all. One viewer commented that this was the first time in their life they felt truly proud to be African. They said the story of Maxwell Chikumbutso, once forgotten, resurrected by the courage of Traoré, restored something that generations had lost faith in African capability. Watching the prototype of the Seth vehicle turn on live TV felt to them like a spiritual moment, proof that God had not forgotten the continent. Another viewer wrote that they cried while watching Traoré's speech. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. With conviction, with clarity, and without apology. The viewer described it as a moment when dignity returned to African leadership, when a president didn't plead with the world, but challenged it. They expressed hope that more leaders across Africa would follow his example, not just in words, but in action. Several viewers shared personal reflections about growing up being told that Africa would always be behind. One woman from Nairobi said she used to hide her ambitions of becoming an inventor because people around her thought it was too Western. After seeing this story, she felt vindicated. They laughed at us for dreaming, she wrote, but now the world is afraid of our dreams. There were also comments from diaspora Africans who felt an emotional pull back to the continent. A software engineer in Canada wrote that he was considering moving to Burkina Faso to volunteer his skills. I left because there were no opportunities, he admitted, but if leaders like Traoré exist, maybe it's time to come back and help build what we once thought impossible. A student in Ghana commented on how their entire classroom watched the Seth prototype reveal together. He said that for the first time, the room was filled with hope instead of frustration. Instead of talking about leaving Africa, they were talking about transforming it. He thanked both Chikumbutso and Traoré for giving young people a new kind of hero, not one in a movie, but one in real life. From across the continent, messages poured in, expressing anger toward how the world treated African genius. Many viewers were outraged at the suppression of Chikumbutso's work. One viewer from Uganda asked, "How many more African inventions have been buried before they could bloom?" He argued that this wasn't just about one car. It was about centuries of erased brilliance. But this time, he added, they failed to bury the flame. A teacher from Malawi said she planned to redesign her science curriculum after reading about Chikumbutso. She wanted her students to learn about African inventors, not just Einstein and Newton. Our children need to see that genius can have skin like theirs, she explained. They need to know that innovation doesn't come only from the West. There were also strong reactions to the coordinated attacks on Burkina Faso. One viewer from Senegal pointed out the hypocrisy. When Africa follows, the world applauds, but when Africa leads, they panic. He said the poisoning cyber attacks and defunding campaigns were proof that what Traoré was doing was real and dangerous to the global status quo. A powerful comment came from an elderly viewer in Ethiopia who recalled the days of anti-colonial struggles. He said this story reminded him of the 1960s when African nations believed in their destiny. But we lost that belief somewhere along the way, he reflected. Now I see it returning, and I will die a happy man, knowing our youth are waking up. Many viewers also turned their comments into calls for action. One woman in Côte d'Ivoire urged African universities to offer Maxwell an honorary doctorate. Another viewer from Tanzania proposed creating a continental tech defense alliance to protect inventors from sabotage. If they can kill one idea, he wrote, they will try to kill others. We need to build shields. A Nigerian electrical engineer expressed admiration but also fear. He said the global energy mafia was too powerful to be taken lightly. This car threatens billion-dollar empires, he warned. Traoré must prepare. We must protect our minds.